Today we'll start on book 4 of the Ethics. The full title is Of Human Bondage or the Strength of the Emotions. This is where Spinoza lays out his ethical theory proper after explaining his theory of knowledge in book 2 and his theory of the emotions in book 3. I think a good place to start is with the scholium to the final proposition in book 2, where he sketches his theory of ethics, the theory that he's going to develop after the interlude on the emotions in book 3. So this is the scholium to proposition 49 in book 2. And I'll begin by reviewing a few of the highlights in book 2, then this scholium, then say a few words about book 3, and start in on the preface of book 4. So book 2 is about Spinoza's theory of knowledge. Under the heading three kinds of knowledge, he actually distinguishes 4 types of knowledge in the second scholium to proposition 40 of book 2. Knowledge from random experience is, if you like, it's unprocessed sense data. It's where our judgment of things is confined to our assessment of the effects that those things have on our bodies. It scarcely qualifies as knowledge at all, so he calls it knowledge from random experience. Secondly, from signs, this means words or symbols, from the fact that having read certain words, or from remembering things, or imagining things. He groups all of these things together under the heading knowledge of the first kind, opinion, or imagination. When he mentions signs here, the take-home message is that, in fact, Spinoza is an extreme nominalist. He's extremely skeptical about universals, particularly abstract universals. So for Spinoza, there are individual trees in nature, but the concept of a tree, that which is represented by the word tree, is a construction of the human mind. And most of these constructions, in Spinoza's view, are just that. They're just mental constructions rather than elements of reality. And this, in particular, applies to the Platonic notion of the good. So, if you've ever encountered the nominalist realist controversy in medieval philosophy, centering around, say, William of Ockham, Spinoza is on the side of the nominalists and generally rejects abstract universals. So when people do talk about universals such as human nature, in Spinoza's view, these are generally confused ideas. They come from, we have distinct ideas of individual people, and we mash them all together to get a confused idea of something like humanity. So that at one fell swoop does cut out large swaths of philosophy that Spinoza is simply not going to engage with. The universals that he does allow or he calls them common notions and adequate ideas of the properties of things, as exemplified by his physics of bodies, which he develops at the beginning of book two. And these, together with logical deductions from these, he shall call reason, or the second kind of knowledge. There's also a third kind of knowledge, which he calls intuitive knowledge, and that actually is not going to come into play until book five. So one way, I think an appropriate way of looking at these three types of knowledge is as three stages of human development. The human mind, as described in book three, is governed by the first type of knowledge. In book four, which we're beginning today, it's governed by the second kind of knowledge, and in book five by the third kind of knowledge. I'll select just two propositions as representative of the message of book two. Proposition 44 states that it is of the nature of reason to regard things as necessary, not as contingent. So reason refers to both the the second and third types of knowledge in this proposition. So contingency, the notion of contingency, Spinoza has already defined it in book one, one of the Scholia to proposition 33. To say that something is contingent, he says, is just a defect of our knowledge. It's the idea that we have that something might not have been, or could have been different, or might turn out differently. For Spinoza, everything in nature is necessary. It follows from the necessity of the divine nature, and there is no contingency except through our lack of understanding, because we are not in a position to know the full causal histories of things. So the corollary, the first corollary, states that it depends only on the imagination, the first type of knowledge. He generally uses imagination as synonymous with the first type of knowledge, although, as we've seen, there are a few other ways of generating confused and fragmented ideas. Okay, from the proposition, he says, it follows that it depends only on the imagination that we regard things as contingent, both in respect to the past and in respect to the future. It's through the imagination, that is, the ability that we have to represent to ourselves as real things that are not present in our immediate experience, that we make conjectures about the future, or that we remember the past. For Spinoza, memory is a species of imagination. There's another corollary which says that it is of the nature of reason to perceive things under a certain species of eternity. Okay, this will give you an idea of the claims that Spinoza is eventually going to make for reason, the third type of knowledge in book five. It does not concern us in book four. One other proposition then from book two. This is proposition 48. It says that in the mind there is no absolute or free will, but the mind is determined to wish this or that by a cause which has also been determined by another cause and is last by another cause, and so on to infinity. Everything for Spinoza, including all of our mental activity, is governed by causal determinism. I don't think it's necessary to elaborate on it. If you spent any time with this series of videos, you will be familiar with Spinoza's stance on this position. But it's clearly the first hurdle that he's going to have to surmount if he's going to develop a theory of ethics, which is what he proposes to do. So here is an extract from the Scholium to the final proposition in Book 2, where he summarizes the ethical theory that he is going to develop in 4 points. He aims to point out the advantages of the doctrine that he's going to develop. The first one, an immediate consequence of the fact that we do not have free will, is that it teaches us to act solely according to the decree of God, and to be partakers in the divine nature, and so much the more as we perform more perfect actions and more understand God. Such a doctrine not only completely tranquilizes our spirit, but also shows us where our highest happiness or blessedness lies, namely in the knowledge of God, and ultimately in what he's going to call the intellectual love of God. Secondly, with regard to the circumstances that we find ourselves in, the events that that befall us, which are beyond our control, it teaches us how we ought to conduct ourselves with respect to the gifts of fortune. All things follow from the necessity of the divine nature. We should await and endure fortune's smiles or frowns with equal mind, seeing that all things follow from the eternal degree of God, by the same necessity as it follows from the essence of a triangle that the 3 angles are equal to 2 right angles. His favorite mathematical analogy for necessary truths. Then, with regard to our relations with other people, the third point, his doctrine, he says, teaches us to hate no man, neither to despise, to deride, to envy, or to be angry with any. Furthermore, as it tells us that each should be content with his own and helpful to his neighbor, not from any womanish pity, favor, or superstition, but solely by the guidance of reason. That's going to be absolutely fundamental. And of course, I suppose we should apologize for this word. Current translations would use something like unmanly. And finally, he says that his doctrine will have consequences for the organization of political institutions. This he went on to develop in his political treatise, which was never finished. But just as Aristotle's politics followed the Nicomachean ethics, Spinoza saw himself as being on the same sort of trajectory in his writings. So this scholium then to the last proposition in Book 2 brings us to the threshold of Book 3. I'm assuming that if you've arrived at this video, you have come from the playlist on Book 3. I'll put a link in the description below, and but I will just summarize Book 3 very, very briefly. The principal theme for Spinoza is to undo the distinction which prevailed traditionally in moral philosophy between emotions or passions on the one hand and virtues or vices on the other hand. Passions are supposed to be things that just happen to us willy-nilly. They're beyond our control. And virtues and vices are supposed to be actions under our control for which we can be praised or blamed uh, because we are supposed to be able to control them through an exercise of the will. The will for Spinoza is another one of these abstract universals that doesn't actually correspond to anything in nature. There are desires, there are volitions, but there's no faculty of the will for Spinoza, let alone faculty of free will. So what he is targeting then is this traditional conception in moral philosophy of a, shall we call it, a Cartesian homunculus that is controlling our behavior by freedom of the will, imposing its will on the intractable parts of our nature. So the picture that he's rejecting is the one that pretends that we can govern ourselves simply by decree or by fighting with ourselves in order to repress the desires that we do not want to act on. What he's actually going to propose, Spinoza, is that this model of human nature is unworkable, and he's going to draw a completely different type of distinction between action and passion. For Spinoza, both actions and passions are emotions. A passive emotion is one in which we do not understand what's going on, and an active emotion is one in which the mind is actively engaged in understanding what's going on. In Spinoza's terminology, it's one in which the mind has an adequate idea of the physical modifications of the body that are the bodily manifestations of the emotion. So this is this fits into a larger picture. Spinoza's answer to Descartes' mind-body dualism is a dual aspect monism. Okay, according to Spinoza, the mind and the body are one and the same thing viewed in different ways. So from a subjective first-person perspective, it looks like a mind. From an objective third-person perspective, it looks like a body. The so for Spinoza, then cognitions and emotions are two sides of the same coin. Every emotion has a cognitive aspect, and we'll see later every cognition has an affective aspect, and the individual emotions are, in Spinoza's picture, they are sort of like competing forces. Some have a greater power for prevailing over other emotions. And this depends on the manifestation of the motion in the body as much as it depends on the truth or falsity of the cognitive aspect of these emotions. We'll see how this plays out in book 4. But be prepared for statements like you can't think your way out of an emotion, that an emotion can only be overcome by another emotion, and that a true knowledge of good and evil, a purely cognitive knowledge of good and evil, is not enough to ensure that you will choose the good over the evil. But the effective, so reason itself, okay, ultimately the explanation for how reason is effective in prevailing over the emotions, it depends on the fact that reason is itself affective. But this idea isn't fully developed until book 5. For Spinoza, the highest form of reason, what he calls intuitive knowledge, is by another name what he calls the intellectual love of God, and it is an emotion. Good. So that's a brief summary then of book 3, and we can now move on to the preface of book 4. And that's, I think, pretty much all I'm going to cover today. Human infirmity in moderating and checking the emotions I named bondage. This is the bondage of the title. You might recognize that Somerset Maugham used that title of human bondage for one of his novels. For when a man is prey to his emotions, he is not his own master, but lies at the mercy of fortune, so much so that he is often compelled, while seeing that which is better for him, to follow that which is worse. So here we have, I think, maybe a worth remembering formulation of the problem of human agency. Okay, it's how do we take ownership for our volitions? And that in turn depends on having a clear idea of which volitions are worth owning. And this is the problem that Spinoza wants to address, because he's not going to accept the classical view that you solve this sort of problem by fighting with yourself or hoping to govern yourself by decree through an exercise of the will. So he says that before I begin, it would be well to make a few prefatory observations on perfection and imperfection, good and evil. At this point, he refers the reader back to the appendix to book 1, which, if you've read it, you will remember is a long tirade against teleology, the idea that God acts with an end in view. For Spinoza, as for the other 17th century rationalists, the only one of the 4 types of causality that Aristotle postulated, the only one that survives in Spinoza's thought, is the idea of efficient causation, which is to say, causation as we generally understand it today. And there is an across-the-board rejection of teleology. The idea of, if you like, that God is an intelligent designer. Spinoza sees this just as a projection of the human being's understanding of himself onto God. In fact, Spinoza's God is, well, there's a proposition in towards the end of book one that sums it up, which states that God creates everything that is within his power to create. God's driving force is sheer fecundity. He strives, insofar as he strives, to create everything that is possible. For Spinoza, everything that is possibly the case is actually the case, and everything that is actually the case is necessarily the case. And Spinoza's God or nature, the term that he applies to all that is extremely far removed from the traditional idea of God as a designer or God as a moral law giver. So what Spinoza is contending with in this preface is the idea that God has prescribed a moral law as the gold standard by which the perfection or imperfection of human nature is to be judged. And he says that this way of thinking comes from an ordinary, all too human way of thinking, giving the example of a man conceiving the conveniences of household life, had a desire to build a house, and the house being inhabited, okay, insofar as it is regarded as a final cause, is nothing else but this particular desire, which is really the efficient cause. So the as we've seen, I think several times, not only in the appendix to part one, but also in book three, perfection and imperfection, or good and bad, are really modes of thinking. He has said several times in book three that we judge a thing to be good if it increases our power of activity, to be bad if it hinders our power of activity, and there is nothing more to the notions of good and bad than this increase or decrease in power. It might be, I think it's actually useful to bear in mind that when Spinoza talks about good and evil, in many instances he might just as well be talking about good and bad, and the Latin word malum does equal duty for both evil and bad. So he says here, as for the terms good and bad, they indicate no positive quality in things regarded in themselves. They are merely modes of thinking or notions which we form from the comparison of things with one another. Nevertheless, though this be so, the terms should still be retained, for inasmuch as we desire to form an idea of man as a type of human nature, which we may hold in view, it will be useful for us to retain the terms in question in the sense that I have indicated. In what follows then, I shall mean by good that which we certainly know to be a means of approaching more readily to the type of human nature which we have set before ourselves, and by bad, that which we certainly know to be a hindrance to us in approaching the set type. He hasn't actually carefully defined this type of human nature, although he says we have set it before ourselves. It becomes very clear very quickly that the ideal type he's referring to here is the person who is governed by reason, the person who seeks to maximize his power of activity in understanding. The solution that he is going to propose to moderating the passions is not to try to repress them or curtail them, but in fact to understand them. And the understanding, as you might expect, will change the nature of the passions given the dual aspect monism where cognitions and bodily modifications are one and the same thing. Okay, so as usual, he starts off with a few definitions. By good, I mean that which we certainly know to be useful to us. By evil, that which we certainly know to be a hindrance to us in the attainment of any good. There's a distinction here now, a rather technical one, that he makes between contingent and possible, which only comes into play around proposition 10 or 12, something like that. And I think is rather of minor importance. So I'm going to skip over it now, come back to it when we need to tease out the difference. By conflicting emotions, he says, I mean those which draw a man in different directions, though they are of the same kind, such as luxury and avarice, which are both species of love and are contraries, not by nature, but by accident. Okay, so we've seen time and time again in book 3 how Spinoza takes the opportunity to show emotions conflicting with each other. This is, for Spinoza, part and parcel of our human condition. And it's primarily just a consequence of the complexity of our nature. For Spinoza, we are not unitary beings, we are composite beings, not singular bodies, but bodies made up of hierarchies of other bodies. So the acrasia that he refers to here in the first paragraph of the preface is just an instance of this. Okay, when a man is prey to his emotions, he is not his own master. Okay, he is often compelled by seeing that which is better for him to follow that which is worse. This is just an instance of conflicting desires. And the remedy that he's going to propose is not to suppress one desire at the expense of the other, but actually make an effort to understand what is going on and see how that an adequate understanding of the situation changes the situation. I need hardly stress how different this is from the idea that you can resolve this sort of conflict by an exercise of free will. But I suppose that nobody will actually come to take an ethical doctrine like Spinoza, seriously, unless they have first exhausted the possibilities of trying to govern themselves by the decrees of the will. So returning here to the conflicting emotions, the point of these definitions, okay, including this one here, an emotion felt towards a thing future and past. Here he's talking about hope and fear, which are products of the imagination. This is the reference to the proposition in Book 3, where he explains the mechanisms behind these emotions and why they always occur as a dyad. There is always vacillation between hope and fear. The point of all these definitions, we'll see, if not next time, then the time after that, Spinoza will have a series of propositions where he wants to show that we can have situations where the cognitive aspect of an emotion is equally true, but the emotions involved will have different strengths, different powers to move the person, depending on the object of the emotion. So the most powerful emotions are those that refer to objects that are present in our immediate experience. And then perhaps emotions that refer to things in the past, which cannot be changed, would come second. And then emotions with respect to events in the future are generally less powerful because we are less certain about the outcomes. And he will then say that emotions which are possible in this sense here are more powerful than emotions which are contingent in this sense. So Spinoza's picture is that the emotions are like forces, emotions or cognitions, because they're two sides of the same coin. They are forces which are in contention with each other frequently. And it is only through the power of reason that we can hope to bring those tensions to a satisfactory resolution and not fall victim to the acrasia that he mentions in the first paragraph. Acrasia, of course, is the Greek word for this situation of knowing the better and doing the worst, acting against our best interest. Two other definitions: by an end, for the sake of which we do something, I mean a desire. And the definition of virtue: by virtue and power, I mean the same thing. And he refers here to the Proposition 7 in Book 3, which states that the conatus is the actual essence of man. This power of activity is what Spinoza defines as virtue. Okay, the power of affecting what can only be understood by the laws of our own nature, the things of which we are the adequate cause. So he's using the word virtue, Latin virtus, in the original pre-Christian sense of the word. It literally meant strength or power, or at its root, manliness. Vir is, of course, the Latin word for man. So be alert for this, because some of his arguments are going to use virtue in this original sense, and it's easy to get confused if you confuse that with the notion of moral virtue as it has become established in say, Christianity. One more thing for today, then there's one axiom to part four. There is no individual thing in nature than which there is not another more powerful and strong. Whatsoever thing be given, there is something stronger whereby it can be destroyed. So he's going from proposition 2 onwards, he is going to draw out several consequences of this axiom concerning the, if you like, the built-in limitations of the conatus. I would say that the sort of biggest difference between Spinoza's conatus and Nietzsche's will to power is that Spinoza is acutely aware of our vulnerability and ephemerality and our dependence on the environment and on other people in order to thrive in a way that Nietzsche just does not seem to be. So I'll conclude then with just one proposition today. Proposition 1, no positive quality possessed by a false idea is removed by the presence of what is true in virtue of its being true. The references here in the proof you'll see are to book 2, where Spinoza explains his conception of the mind as the idea of the body. All the mind knows about external bodies are how those external bodies affect its own body. And that is to say that the bodily aspect of the cognition determines the cognitive aspect. So in understanding this proposition, he gives examples such as we judge the distance of the sun from the earth by the effect that the warmth of the sun has on our body and by the its apparent size. And so we conclude that it's maybe 200 feet away. And this is obviously false, but knowing the true distance does not change our bodily sensations. So it still looks to us as if it was just 200 feet away. The false idea is not removed by the presence of what is true. And he gives another example here about the emotions. He talks about how we might mistakenly fear an evil, and the fear vanishes when we hear true tidings. So this is an instance where truth overcomes falsity. But it's just as common to see the converse, that we fear an evil which will certainly come to pass, and our fear vanishes when we hear false tidings. So the false overcomes the true. So the way to read this proposition is that merely knowing what is good for us, okay, a true knowledge of good and evil is not going to be sufficient to get us to do the right thing. And he will later flesh this out with statements such as only an emotion can overcome another emotion. And our knowledge of what is good and evil, he will say, is nothing but the emotions of pleasure and pain, insofar as we are conscious of them. So he's going to play heavily on this dual aspect cognition, uh, emotion in the arguments in book form. Good. Okay, I'll stop there for today.